William McGonagall, the author of the Tay Bridge disaster and other monumentally leaden poems written in the 19th century, described him, and all of which he dedicated to Queen Victoria, described himself as poet and tragedian. I think, in any sort of comparable effort, we'd have to call James Dorsey a political commentator extraordinaire. And it's a great pleasure to have him here. James is a senior fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU, focused on the Middle East and North Africa. And he has had a long career as a journalist, for a career of 40-odd years in the Middle East, Latin America, Europe, and the US for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Financial Times. Most recently, and perhaps for this audience here, he has become known as a commentator on the Middle East, and above all, the author of this famous blog called The Turbulent World of Middle Eastern Soccer. But, or is it football?
It's soccer.
Soccer, yes. And, I imagined that it was.
But only for opportunistic reasons.
Yes, of course. And he has, experienced many recent crises, relatively recent crises in the Middle East at first hand, including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian Revolution, the US Embassy hostage crisis, and wars in Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Serbia, and so on. And as I say, but fortunately for us, he is here in Singapore and writing these comments. I don't know how he finds the time to, smoke these little cigars because these comment pieces are produced two or three times a week. It is really quite extraordinary. I should also like to pay tribute to James's courageousness as a journalist, and that he's survived really, I would have thought, for a lesser person, sort of bone-shattering and probably mind-shattering libel cases, which he has won, 2 important cases. This is, I think, quite something. Anyway, today he is going to talk about Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, a paradigm shift. And as always, I'm very keen to hear what he has to say.
Peter, thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to see a lot of friends, familiar faces, and a few unfamiliar faces. When Peter asked me to do this talk, he did it on the basis of a piece that I had written for a journal shortly after the Gaza war last year, but that only got published, I think, early this month or late last month. And indeed, that piece was entitled Israeli-Palestinian Peacemaking, a Paradigm Shift. Since then, this being the Middle East, the paradigm shifts all the time, and probably is shifting as we speak now. Let me just start off with pointing out what I think are some of the shifts that we're seeing taking place at the moment. There are several in my mind. One is the restructuring of the security architecture in the Middle East, with the current de facto and ultimately de jure return of Iran to an international community, and the increased legitimization of its role in the region, which will have an impact on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Another is U.S.-Israeli relations in the wake of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to the U.S. Congress. A de facto changing relationship between Israel and Hamas, despite the rhetoric and continued demonization of the Islamist group, that in effect amounts, in my mind again, to a struggle over the terms on which negotiations will take place. Palestinians, including Hamas, increasingly are emerging as proponents of peace as Israel hardens its positions. And finally, we have next week's Israeli elections. And let me just make one cautionary note about those elections. Elections are not simply won in Israel on who emerges as the largest party. They are won, Israeli governments are inevitably coalition governments, and they are won on who can form the coalition. In this election, Moreover, you have a president who is believed to be favoring a national unity government, and therefore, ultimately, who wins that election is who forms the government, and we will have to see that. Against that background, I would argue that for much of Israel's existence, Israelis believed that their security depended on achieving full-fledged peace with the Jewish state's Arab neighbors. That notion was refined in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, with Israeli and Palestinians accepting that peace should entail the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. For Palestinians, endorsement of a two-state solution meant acceptance of painful compromises involving surrender of claims to pre-1967 Israeli territory and the effective surrender of the right of 1948 refugees to return to their homes. Palestinian difficulty in translating that acceptance into policy allowed Israel to evade taking the painful decisions peace would require, such as a withdrawal from the West Bank and some form of sharing of sovereignty in Jerusalem. Unwittingly, the Palestinians' inability to grab opportunity by the horn enabled Israel to instead tighten its grip on the West Bank and Jerusalem and make any partition increasingly difficult. The Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking paradigm has shifted over the last 3 decades. After peace treaties with Israel and Jordan, historic agreements with the Palestinians on mutual recognition, cooperation in various sectors, various failed roadmaps to peace, and multiple wars between Israel and non-state actors such as the Lebanese Shiite Muslim Hezbollah militia and Hamas, peace is no longer perceived in much of Israel as a must. Political cooperation works without peace. Business is booming. Phone calls in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi or to Casablanca no longer need to be routed through New York. You can do it through Skype. And companies dedicated to Israeli-Arab transactions manage the process from European capitals. Life is good. The Palestinian issue has been reduced to a nuisance. For Israelis, it has become an issue of management rather than solution. Netanyahu has suggested that for some time, most recently yesterday, when he was quoted as saying that his commitment to a demilitarized Palestinian state was irrelevant, a quote the Prime Minister's office now denies. All of this is not to say that there is not strong public support for a two-state solution in Israel. Witness yesterday's protest march. The problem is that the devil is in the details. If there is anything to be learned from 3 decades of futile peacemaking efforts, it is that. The notion of a two-state solution is a catch-all phrase, and the question is on what terms a Palestinian state would be established alongside Israel. Ironically, changed Israeli perceptions of peacemaking were long mirrored on the Palestinian side. A debilitating feud between Hamas and Palestine Authority President Mahmoud Abbas's al-Fatah movement that put the Islamists in control of Gaza, coupled with Israeli intransigence, effectively stymied Abbas's ability to achieve peace. In effect, Israel and Hamas shared tacit common interests. Neither wanted a final solution, but both favored a long-term ceasefire, provided that it enabled them to further social and economic development. That prospect, however, was undermined by a debilitating Israeli land, sea, and air blockade of Gaza designed to prevent Hamas from arming itself, a policy that ultimately failed with the Islamist group's use of underground smuggling tunnels. Abbas's helplessness, coupled with Israeli and Hamas intransigence, nonetheless reaffirmed a long-standing fact of life of the Israeli-Palestinian equation. Hardliners can serve each other's needs to mutual benefit without making the kind of wrenching concessions that thwart the ambitions of peacemakers and moderates on both sides. A prisoner swap in 2011, in which Israel bought freedom for Staff Sergeant Gilad Shalit after 5 years in Palestinian captivity in exchange for the release of 1,027 prisoners, many of whom were responsible for deadly attacks on Israel, highlighted the fact that sworn enemies found it easier to do business than those who advocate compromise and living in peace and harmony side by side. It's important to note that the prisoner exchange was not without historic precedent. In 1983, Israel exchanged 4,765 prisoners, most of them held in Ansar in southern Lebanon, but some in Israeli prisons, for 6 soldiers. The precedent goes far beyond Israel's willingness to return its military personnel from captivity at whatever price. It involved a negotiation between then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and the PLO, at a time that the PLO in Israeli terms was a terrorist organization. In fact, the negotiation went beyond indirect contacts through Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky. Never published is the fact that Begin invited a senior PLO official, Issam Sartawi, to visit Jerusalem, as well as the prison in southern Lebanon, with full guarantee of his safety, security, and immunity while in territories under Israeli control. The opportunity was missed when PLO leader Yasser Arafat barred Sartawi from traveling to Israel. Underlying the swap with Hamas was a belief on the part of Netanyahu and Hamas that there is no realistic chance for an agreement on peace terms that would be acceptable to both Palestinians and Israelis. Given the nature of his coalition agreement, Netanyahu had been unwilling or unable to give Abbas the bare minimum he would need to push forward with peace without at least the tacit backing of Hamas. While Netanyahu officially refused to negotiate with Hamas, for its part, Hamas refused Israeli conditions for its inclusion in a peace process, including the recognition of Israel's right to exist, abandonment of armed struggle, and acceptance of past Israeli-Palestinian agreements. If anything, the prisoner swap and Hamas's military performance in confrontation with Israel reinforced the Islamist movement's conviction that its hard line was paying off. Netanyahu strengthens Hamas in its conviction, not only by excluding Abbas from the prisoner swap, but also by his decision at the time to build a new Jewish settlement on the southern edge of Jerusalem and the granting of legal status to settlements established without his government's approval. Netanyahu's move flew in the face of Abbas's efforts to make an Israeli freeze on settlements a core precondition for peace talks with the Israelis. The paradigm of a tacit Israeli-Hamas understanding bolstered intransigence on both sides and neutered Abbas's ability to take advantage of Hamas's position, weakened by the 2013 military coup in Egypt, in which Hamas's foremost ally, Islamist President Mohamed Morsi, was overthrown, a rift between Hamas and Iran over Hamas's refusal to back the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, the Israeli blockade's increasing destruction of the Gaza economy, and mounting international criticism of Israel fueled by its brutal assault on the Gaza Strip. If Israel was long the proponent of peace, Hamas had opened the door to Palestinians replacing it in that role. Indirect ceasefire talks in Cairo, designed to end the 2014 Israel-Hamas war and achieve a lasting ceasefire, and post-ceasefire negotiations effectively constituted discussions about the parameters of a potential future peace agreement. Israeli rhetoric notwithstanding, signs of changing attitudes of Israel and Hamas towards one another went significantly beyond the fact that the two sworn enemies who refused to recognize one another were negotiating, even if only indirectly. They also went beyond the fact that the road to the Cairo talks was paved in part on indirect negotiations between Hamas and the United States, which, like Israel, has declared Hamas a terrorist organization. Netanyahu announced changed Israeli attitudes towards Hamas when he defined Israel's goal in the Gaza war as the weakening of Hamas's military capability, if not the demilitarization of the group, rather than his long-standing objective of total destruction of the organization. While Israel seemed to be indiscriminate in its risking of civilian casualties during the war, Hamas's senior leadership in the Strip emerged from the fighting unscathed. The negotiations, despite their cyclical breakdowns, did not only acknowledge Hamas as a key player in any long-lasting arrangement with Israel, but also constituted the recognition of the fact that the Islamist group looks a lot better than other militant Palestinian groups in Gaza, such as Islamic Jihad, which has often played the role of an agent provocateur, trying to force conflict in an environment in which both Hamas and Israel would have wanted to avoid military confrontation. Even if Hamas does not comprise the moderate Palestinians that Israel and its Western backers prefer to deal with, it looks a lot better than the Islamic State, which occupies significant parts of Syria and Iraq. Israel's acknowledgement of Hamas as the best of a bad bunch was evident in the substance of the Cairo talks, the building blocks of a future state, and a two-state resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, ruled by a Palestinian national unity government, open borders, a seaport, extended territorial waters, and an airport. in exchange for military and security arrangements that ensure the security of both Israel and the Palestinians. Anat Kurtz, the director of Tel Aviv University's Institute for National Security Studies, which has close ties to Israel's government and security establishment, reflected the changed attitudes in official Israeli thinking. Israel does not want to destroy Hamas. There's a shift in the Israeli position. Israel wants to leave Hamas enough capability because it is the most organized force in the Gaza Strip, she said. She acknowledged that the labeling of a group as terrorist often served as a way of avoiding negotiations that could involve painful compromises. Ironically, Kurtz's articulation of changed Israeli attitudes mirrored statements by Hamas leader Khaled Mishal, including his assessment of Israel's demand that Hamas first recognize the Jewish state and denounce armed struggle before any potential direct talks. In a lengthy interview with Al Jazeera, Mishal described the Israeli demands as a tool to evade negotiations and noted that the United States and the Viet Cong negotiated an end to the Vietnam War while the fighting continued. The argument throws the ball into the Palestinian court. We will not surrender to Israeli blackmail, Mishal said. He noted further that a quarter of a century after Arafat first renounced violence and then recognized Israel, Palestinians had yet to secure their rights. More importantly, both in his explicit remarks and in the tone of his interview, Mishal made clear that Hamas had signed on to a two-state resolution that would end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with the establishment of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. We accept the state with the 1967 borders, but Israel doesn't. That makes solution difficult to achieve, Mishal said. Changed Israeli and Hamas attitudes, however, do not automatically lead to a solution. Nevertheless, they are a sine qua non for any long-standing arrangement, whether a ceasefire or a final peace agreement. So far, neither Israel nor Hamas have demonstrated the political will to build on the change in the way they eye each other. Intractable but managed hostility suits both Israel and Hamas. The change is nonetheless significant. Hamas has clearly stated what it has long been signaling. Israel is there to stay. Mishal has downplayed the Hamas charter that calls for Israel's destruction, much like PLO leader Arafat did earlier with regard to the PLO charter, saying that it is a piece of history and no longer relevant, but cannot be changed for internal reasons. Mishal's number two, Musa Abu Marzouk, noted that the charter is not the Quran. It can be amended. Their statements echo the words of the late Israeli Defense Minister Asa Weizmann, who some 30 years ago stood in front of his Likud party emblem that showed Jordan as part of Israel and said with regard to the charter of the PLO that at the time called for Israel's demise, we can dream, so can they. The changing Israeli and Hamas attitudes reflect the fact that the most recent Israeli destruction of Gazan infrastructure failed to prevent the Islamist group from inflicting significant political and psychological damage on Israel. Hamas's refusal to bow to Israeli military superiority, as well as its uncompromising insistence on the lifting of the 8-year-old Israeli-Egyptian blockade of the Gaza Strip and the right to furnish it with an airport and a seaport, caught Israel by surprise. Hamas's steadfastness left Israel with few good options. The effects of Hamas's strategy were evident on the ground. Beyond having been forced into a war of attrition, Israeli towns and settlements adjacent to the Gaza Strip turned a majority of their residents into internal refugees. Debka File, a news website with close ties to Israel's military and intelligence establishment, described the havoc Hamas wreaked in southern Israel as a strategic achievement on a par with Hamas's success in closing Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion International Airport for a couple of days during the war. In addition, Israel's international standing was significantly dented, highlighted at the time by US and British suggestions that they may review arms sales to the Jewish state more stringently, and stepped up calls for sanctions against Israel. An Israeli newspaper headline read, "After 7 weeks of Gaza war, Hamas won, Israel 0." The Israeli-Palestinian conflagration in Gaza constituted a watershed, with Israel struggling to counter mounting international criticism of its disproportionate use of force and the Palestinians' increasingly united refusal of agreements that do not take into account their interests. The new Palestinian resolve was rooted in a measure of temporary reconciliation between Hamas and Abbas. Hamas's transition from an embattled group unable to pay public sector salaries prior to the Israeli assault into a resistance movement with street credibility, and in the absence of Arab support in the Gaza war, a realization that Palestinians will have to rely on their own resources. That process has been interrupted, but in my mind not terminated, by an effort by both Israel and Abbas to identify Hamas with the larger peril of an aggressive Islamist Iran, political Islam in other parts of the Middle East, and jihadist groups. The landscape could, however, quickly change if the PLO moves ahead with its threat to suspend security cooperation with Israel, if a post-election Israeli government fails to renew remittances to the Palestinian Authority of taxes Israel is currently holding in escrow. Post-Gaza, Palestinian resolve was further strengthened by the performance of Palestinian fighters on the ground. Palestinian rockets were able to target urban centers deep inside Israel, even if they were unable to defeat the Jewish state's Iron Shield anti-missile system. Moreover, Palestinian fighters on several occasions reached Israel through their tunnels, killing a significant number of Israeli soldiers on Israeli soil. In addition, international public opinion was turning against Israel as casualties in Gaza mounted, and the recognition seeped in that Hamas will have to be a party to any lasting ceasefire or credible effort to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Similarly, many Arab governments saw whatever street credibility they had reduced because of their silent endorsement of the Israeli assault on Hamas, which they view as an extension of their effort to destroy the Muslim Brotherhood. At the same time, Qatar was gaining popularity with its support of Hamas, an offshoot of the Brotherhood. The newly found resolve translated into Palestinians across the board demanding that any lasting ceasefire be linked to their political demands, first and foremost among which a lifting of the 8-year-old blockade of Gaza. The demands were endorsed not only by Hamas, but also by the Palestine Authority, which, incapable of coming to the aid of the embattled population of Gaza, had been weakened and appeared helpless as Hamas fighters took on the Israelis. With mass protests in support across the West Bank, in support of Gaza across the West Bank, both Hamas and the Authority needed to be watchful that the demonstrations did not turn against them, given that their 7-year-old feud had rendered Palestinians ineffective in peace efforts and effectively played into Israel's divide and rule strategy. While some analysts believe that economic progress on the West Bank makes it unlikely that its residents will want to risk their well-being with a third intifada or popular revolt, both Hamas and the Authority may ultimately see civil disobedience as a way to keep Palestinian anger focused on Israel. That has become a more distinct possibility in recent days with the Palestinians' threat to suspend security cooperation and charge Israel with reassuming all responsibility in the West Bank as an occupying power. The move would amount to a de facto dismantling of the Palestinian Authority as the governing entity in the West Bank. Initially, Gaza and now the PA's projection of Palestine as a state through membership in United Nations organizations, including the International Criminal Court, may align the interests of Hamas and the Authority. This was reflected in last summer's little-noticed Palestinian demand that Israel recognize the reconciliation between the two groups as part of any lasting ceasefire. Israel had denounced the reconciliation agreement that was supposed to create the basis for the formation of a national unity government backed by both Hamas and al-Fatah, the backbone of Abbas's Palestine Authority. The primary motive of the Israeli assault in Gaza is believed among large circles to have been the undermining of that reconciliation. That effort has temporarily succeeded, even if in the minds of many it has longer term strengthened the basis for a greater degree of Palestinian unity. Hamas is no longer a terror group carrying out attacks. It's a mini-army in a mini-state, said Amir Oren, a columnist for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. The turning of international public opinion against Israel, the private, if not public, dismay in Western capitals at the heavy-handedness of the Israelis in Gaza, Netanyahu's potentially politically damaging post-mortem of the war, as well as the strengthened Palestinian resolve, all had the makings of a paradigm shift in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How the shift plays out will depend on whether the war in Gaza sparks the third intifada, as well as on developments in Israel, including the forthcoming election, the fallout of the postmortem, and the impact on Israel of the loss of significant empathy in international public opinion, as well as among its most important allies, the United States and Europe. In a bid to manage the unilateral Israeli end to the fighting in Gaza, Netanyahu and other officials embarked after the Gaza war on a victory campaign, claiming significant damage to thousands of alleged terror targets, the destruction of dozens of tunnels, a strengthening of the ties with Arab states such as Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, and a warning that if Hamas continues to attack Israel, Palestinians will pay an intolerable price. That narrative could be easily punctured by a Palestinian attack. As Haaretz columnist Yossi Werther warned, the dangers facing Netanyahu are immeasurable. If the rocket fire resumes, he is likely to be held responsible for national humiliation, which would cause him to lose support from within his coalition and party, and ultimately the Prime Minister's office as well. If this weekend's mass demonstration against Netanyahu is any indication, Netanyahu could be facing a tough election next week. The initial post-Gaza ceasefire talks bought Netanyahu time, but he could not eliminate the threat as long as agreement was not reached on Palestinian demands. Both Hamas and the Palestine Authority are reserving their counsel until after the Israeli election. The elections will determine whether the fallout of the Gaza war ultimately leads to an Israeli government more inclined to make painful concessions necessary for an Israeli-Palestinian peace, or one that is even more intransigent and hardline than the one Netanyahu currently heads. Whichever way, it would, together with the newly found Palestinian resolve, constitute a paradigm shift. The fallout is also likely to impact Israeli military and intelligence strategies and focus. Israeli military and intelligence sources attributed their failure to predict Hamas's ability to stand up to punishing military strikes to a decision in the last decade to focus on the country's intelligence resources on gathering tactical intelligence. Israel's military focused on ensuring weapons and training superiority, rather than on understanding the enemy's strategy, mindset, and evaluation of the local and international environment in which it operates. As a result, Israeli intelligence and security agencies had cut back on personnel, seeking to understand the broader picture in which Hamas and other groups operate. Proponents of the shift in focus pointed to the Israeli successes in recent years, including the 2008 assassination in Damascus of Imad Mughniyeh, a widely respected Hezbollah and Iranian operative who masterminded attacks on Israeli and U.S. targets, as well as a host of kidnappings of foreigners in Lebanon, including the CIA's station chief. They also listed the killing of Iranian nuclear scientists in Iran and elsewhere, the Stuxnet cyber attack on Iranian computer systems related to the Islamic Republic's nuclear program, and the 2007 destruction of a Syrian plutonium reactor built with the help of Iran and North Korea. They further argued that Israeli forces involved in Gaza benefited from superior tactical knowledge. Those successes notwithstanding, Israeli intelligence was unable to provide Netanyahu and members of his security cabinet with the necessary strategic analysis to preempt what had become a classic example of Machiavelli's pursuit by Hamas of diplomacy by other means. Israeli intelligence inability was already evident in faulty analysis of the popular Arab revolts that toppled the leaders of Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen, as well as Syrian President al-Assad's strategy of allowing the Islamic State to emerge as a major rebel group so that he could substantiate his claim that he was fighting a terrorist phenomenon that threatens not only his regime, but also the region as a whole and the West. The intelligence failure left, in the words of Debka File, the initiative in Hamas's hands, and Israel ignorantly navigating its military moves towards a ceasefire instead of winning the war. Despite its inferiority in fighting strength and weaponry, Israel's enemy uses this ambivalence to retain the element of surprise and keep the IDF moving without direction. The intelligence failure also made Netanyahu more vulnerable to criticism that Israel would be unable to militarily defeat Hamas in a war of attrition that takes an increasing toll on Israel's population and limited his freedom to maneuver in the post-ceasefire negotiation with the Palestinians. As a result, Some of the Prime Minister's critics, including former Defense Minister Moshe Aaron, appeared willing to concede to some of Hamas's demands in the absence of Israel's ability to wage a military campaign aimed at complete disarmament of Hamas, on condition that the government be prepared for another round of fighting, which the critics viewed as inevitable at some point in the future. The situation bolstered by the potential of renewed widespread Palestinian protest should the Palestine Authority resolve itself of its responsibility for the administration of the West Bank, echoes the situation in the late 1980s during the first Palestinian Intifada that set the stage for the U.S. recognition of the PLO and ultimately the Oslo peace process. At the time, the Israeli military advised then Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin that it could suppress the revolt, but not at a price that either the military or the government would be willing to accept. In effect, the military told Rabin, "This is a political, not a military problem. You resolve it." Against the backdrop of Israeli concern about the boycott, sanctions, and disinvestment movement, that scenario could repeat itself even if the nature of the Israeli military has changed with greater influence of religious elements and the fact that the military is a reflection of Israel's more general shift to the right. The increased prominence of religious and conservative forces in the Israeli military was evident in the words of the commander of Israel's elite infantry Givati Brigade, Colonel Ofer Winter, that suffered high casualties in Gaza. Winter declared the holy war on the Palestinians in a message to his troops at the beginning of the Gaza war. He said, "The Lord God of Israel make our way successful. We're going to war for your people Israel against an enemy that defames you." Criticism in Israel nevertheless focuses on the military's politically mandated strategy and its failure in recent years to recognize and review its doctrine and strategy in a world in which Israel is more likely to confront unconventional rather than conventional forces. Israel's last 4 wars were against Hezbollah and Hamas rather than conventional Arab armies. Amos Harel, one of Israel's most respected military commentators, noted that these phenomena show that the IDF, especially the ground forces, need to think hard and plan anew. Israel's technically advanced forces found an enemy playing in a different field, thus eroding its advantages. The Israeli Air Force, with the assistance of military intelligence and Israel's internal security service, can strike its targets with great precision. But against Hamas or Hezbollah, this may not be enough to win decisively. If the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, wants to preserve its ability to win using maneuvers, quite extensive changes must be considered. The debate about the Israeli military comes not only against the backdrop of the military's changed demography. The Netanyahu government is a different beast compared to that of Rabin. Netanyahu's government in the first week of the assault on Gaza turned down a proposal to conduct lightning strikes inside Gaza that would have destroyed Hamas's command and control centers and other military infrastructure. It also refused to entertain a proposal for a full reoccupation of the Gaza Strip. Debka files suggested that had Israel opted for lightning strikes at an early stage in the conflict, instead of 10 days of airstrikes, it might have saved Palestinian losses and property devastation, the extent of which troubles most Israelis too. Israel's liberal Haaretz newspaper added in an editorial, "When you're too heavy, big, or bloated, it's hard to move, run, or even bend down. Your arm is so fat, it can't reach into a tunnel. It gets stuck, and you stand there helplessly." That's precisely the situation with the Israel Defense Forces. It's a King Kong of an army, big and cumbersome. Every move unintentionally knocks down a house, bridge, or a UN school in Gaza. The top brass has forgotten the line in the book of Proverbs, "With wise advice thou shalt make thy war." Reorganizing the military and revamping its doctrine and strategy is no mean task. It involves a debate that by definition will have to also include Israel's broader policies towards the Palestinians at a time that popular anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian sentiment is running high. The debate about military strategy received another boost in the wake of Netanyahu's speech to the US Congress, with disagreement of his evaluation of the threat posed by Iran at the cost of focusing on the Palestinians. The criticism was strengthened with the arrest virtually as Netanyahu spoke of 3 Israeli businessmen suspected of smuggling industrial materials
including metal bars, sheet metal for construction, electric and electronic devices, and communications equipment into Gaza, allegedly for the building of new tunnels. I'd like to end these remarks with some loose notes that in my mind are key to the situation itself, as well as putting it into a historic context. Israeli policies are bolstered by understandings with conservative Arab states that are partly rooted in shared distrust of and opposition to Iran, and that have generated enough confidence on both sides for Israelis and Arabs to be more public about their common positions in the absence of formal diplomatic relations and despite disagreement over the Palestinian issue. General Amos Gilad, the Israeli Defense Ministry's Director of Policy and Political Military Relations, who played a key role in forging Israel's alliance with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, hinted at the close cooperation with Arab states during a visit to Singapore last year. Everything is underground. Nothing is public. But our security cooperation with Egypt and the Gulf states is unique. This is the best period of security and diplomatic relations with the Arabs. Relations with Egypt have improved dramatically, Gilad said. That cooperation resulted, among other things, in the Egyptian court last month labeling Hamas a terrorist organization. On the assumption that Israeli conservative Arab cooperation will intensify, Arab states will ultimately need to see progress in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Second of all, I would not underestimate the significance of the BDS movement, but I also think one needs to be realistic. The playing of the Iranian card as an existential threat has served Netanyahu as a tool to overshadow BDS, which Israeli officials see as a Syria threat. BDS's strength is in the fact that it constitutes a threat that targets Israel's positioning of itself as a democratic state and the morality that it claims. However, the likelihood of BDS equating the boycott of South Africa anytime soon is zero. Nonetheless, there are cracks that can be exploited. One should not underestimate the significance of Netanyahu playing partisan politics in the United States. In doing so, Netanyahu was building on changes in the U.S.-Israeli relationship that started when Likud in 1977 first broke the Labour Party's dominance of Israeli politics, and the rise of the Republicans, with whom Likud has greater affinity, first in the Senate in the 1980s, and then in both houses of Congress in the 1990s. Relations between the Republicans and Likud were in recent decades bolstered by increased fundamentalist Christian support for Israel. They are further symbolized by the fact that Israel's ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, is a former Republican political consultant. Closer ties between the Republicans and the Likud were mirrored in a gradual distancing between Israel and the Democrats, illustrated by the founding in 2008 by Jeremy Ben-Ami, a former aide to President Bill Clinton of J Street, a more liberal pro-Israel lobby that sought to offset the influence of the American Israel Political Action Committee, AIPAC, the powerful pro-Likud Israel lobby. Israel retains broad bipartisan support in Congress, despite the fact that more than 50 Democratic members, like President Barack Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry, boycotted Netanyahu's visit and speech. Nevertheless, by engaging in U.S. partisan politics, Netanyahu has sharpened the dividing lines and further cemented the gradually changing nature of Israel's relationships with dominant U.S. political players. In doing so, he risks creating cracks that could allow the Obama or future Democratic administrations greater opportunity to pressure Israel, assuming Netanyahu's Likud is able to hold on to power in this month's elections. By the same token, the tone and atmospherics of U.S.-Israeli relations could change if a coalition headed by the Labour Party leader, Isaac Herzog, who is more comfortable with the Democrats, emerges victorious. That could convince the Obama administration to renew its push for a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Finally, I'd like to situate what I describe as a paradigm shift in the context of changing Israeli and Palestinian attitudes towards one another over a period of 4 decades. In many ways, the complex dance between Israel and Hamas that I described is rooted in a process that started in the early 1970s, when the PLO, prompted by Nayef Hawatmeh, the leader of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the DFLP, and subsequently supported by men like Mahmoud Abbas, took the first tentative steps towards a political rather than a military solution. Those steps were initiated by the ability of an American Trotskyite labor leader, Paul Jacobs, to convince Hawatmeh and then leftist Labor Party Secretary General Lova Eliav to initiate a dialogue. Like the Gaza wars that puncture an Israeli-Hamas process, violence punctured the process in the 1970s. Hawatmeh took the first step with a full-page ad in Israeli newspaper Yediot Ahronot, the first time a PLO representative had directly addressed the Israeli public. The ad was supposed to be the basis for a meeting between Hawatmeh and Eliav in Tunisia under President Habib Bourguiba's auspices. The meeting never took place. Under pressure from more militant Palestinians, Hawatmeh sent Fedayeen from Lebanon to Israel, where they attacked an elementary school, taking more than 100 school children hostage. Israel, for the first time ever, agreed to negotiate with people it considered terrorists. The negotiations were thwarted ultimately by then Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, and 25 girls were killed in Israel's effort to militarily end the hostage situation. The process nevertheless led to the PLO at its Palestine National Congress in Cairo in 1977 to adopt for the first time the notion of a Palestinian entity that it would exist alongside the State of Israel. The notion crystallized into the concept of a Palestinian state, first in a statement that was issued in 1978 by then Chancellors Bruno Kreisky of Austria and Willy Brandt of Germany, but that was drafted by a senior PLO official and then former Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, and ultimately in the Palestinian National Congress in 1983 in Algiers, in the wake of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the PLO's expulsion from Beirut. The 1983 PNC led to Arafat's acceptance in 1988 of US terms for American recognition of the PLO and the subsequent failed peace processes. Those 4 decades of torturous evolution of political positions and stillborn peace efforts were certainly in their first phase a negotiation of the terms on which peace talks would take place. Hamas's approach is rooted in that experience. If there is a paradigm shift, I would argue that below the veils of wars, rhetoric, and violence, we are again witnessing a jostling for positions on the terms on which talks would occur. That process could well be influenced by the forthcoming Israeli elections, how the next Israeli government will handle the Palestine Authority threat to resolve itself with administrative responsibilities, and how serious the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is about the threat if the next Israeli government fails to address its concerns. Thank you.